And welcome back. As we continue looking at Python, today let's go ahead and take a look at our conditional statements of if, elif, and else. So the first thing we're going to start off with is Boolean values. If you want to evaluate Boolean values in Python, you're still going to get the expected outputs of true or false that we're already familiar with from using Java. The bool function allows you to evaluate any value and gives you the true or false in return. So for example, I would say print bool hello or print bool 15. We would of course be able to evaluate that and get a Boolean value. Now by default, most Booleans are going to more evaluate towards true than they are towards false. So that's something to kind of keep in mind if you of course are just trying to test a Boolean value on its own. Now let's take that knowledge about Booleans now and apply that to how Python handles conditions and if statements. So Python has the usual logical conditions that we might expect from a programming language. So for example, we have equals, which is just equals equals. We have not equals, which is the not equal, less than, or less than or equal to, greater than, and greater than or equal to. Now these logical operators, of course, can form Boolean expressions, or we can use them to create our if statements in order to evaluate code. So let's start first with a simple if statement. If we were to look at one, we could say very easily, if b is greater than a, colon, print, quote, b is greater than a, end quote. And one thing you'll note about this is that Python relies much more on indentation to find scope instead of the curly brackets that we're used to. And you also notice that we don't have to use parentheses around the b is greater than a. You can, and I do tend to, because I just know then I have a proper defining bound for these, and it's parenthesizing my expression. However, a bigger thing that you need to note is that even though we're not using a curly bracket here and we're relying on tabs, you will notice that there is a semicolon here. And that's another reason why I like to use the parentheses personally, is because then I know when I have that closing semicolon, I know I need to put a closing parenthesis. I can put that colon right there. It's an easy way for me to remember that. Now, any code that is part of the if statement is tabbed under the if. So again, we're relying on indentation here. So you can see this print b is greater than a is tabbed over, which of course tells Python that that is a statement that belongs to that if. Now, of course, we can also do elif statements. Now, this is a term that's a little different, but you could probably guess what the equivalent would be if we're using a language such as Java. Instead of using else if, as we may be used to, Python uses the very similar but slightly different syntax of elif. So let's just say we have two variables, a and b. Let's say I said a is 33, b is 33. I say if b is greater than a, we're going to print it out that b is greater. Or if they're equal, we can just print out that they're equal. And again, you'll notice that elif shares the same syntax as an if statement. And again, I'm showing here that you don't need parentheses here because, again, the same thing applies with elif statements here. Again, you can use parentheses. It's not going to affect your code at all. I personally use parentheses here just because it parenthesizes my expression, which when we look at compound expressions, it's very useful so you know exactly where things are. But again, you don't need to have them in place here. And as we already talked about, we can look at this expression, very easily evaluate it, and get the elif as the triggering condition here. Now, lastly, of course, we have our else statements. Now, of course, our else is going to function just like how we would expect it to. It's a keyword that catches anything which isn't caught by the preceding conditions. It's our bucket. It's our catch-all. So in this one, I've set a to 233. B is 33 still. And of course, if we look at our conditions, we have b is greater than a if it is greater. A equals b for a and b are equal. And then our else, you notice there's no condition because, again, it's just catching any other situation that might be present. And is a logical conclusion to say, hey, if we evaluate this expression, in this particular instance, only this else statement is going to be true to display a is greater than b. And just like with other programming languages, remember, as soon as it finds that first condition that's true, whether it's an if, it has multiple else ifs, or just an if and else, it's always going to have the same kind of thing where it's like as soon as it finds that first condition, so let's just say it was the else if is true, it's not going to evaluate the else because as soon as it finds the condition is true, it exits out of that switch statement or that branching condition and says, we're done with that segment of code. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at this in Visual Studio Code here. And just to give us some examples of how this can work. So here I have my main method set up, and we're printing out demonstrating if-else statements. And you can see I have a num variable that's going to get an integer input. And we're saying enter a number between -100 and 100. And for this one, notice we're not testing to see if it's a valid number range. We're simply just going to assume that the user is putting in a correct number. But let's just say that if they entered a positive number, you can see the number is positive. We have an else if that says the number is negative, and then I have an else that says this number must be 0. If I wanted to change this code to make it so that it's more comprehensive, I could very easily say elif and say, for example, num equals 0. And if I wanted to have something that would catch a number that's not in that bound, I can very easily come in here and say else and add in a print statement that says you entered a number that is not in the range. And that's a very easy way for us to catch that. And again, here you can now see we have multiple else if statements. And similar down here, we are doing one now for a line of text because this is numeric, which is very easy to handle. But what's if we had a text? Because one thing I didn't talk about in the notes here is how do we handle strings? Because if you remember, in a language like Java, Java doesn't have a string as a primitive type. Instead, it has it as an object type. Well, in Python, it treats it very similar to our primitives because you notice we're using equals here in our string comparisons. Because it's not using object references in memory, it can then do a literal comparison. So in here, if I get a line of text, I can then run it through here and just compare it. So like line equals computer, line equals phone, line equals pager. Again, there's no need to have a special method that's going to do that. So let's just go ahead and run this program just to see what we get. So we can enter a number between -100 and 100. Let's just go ahead and say 15, hit enter, and we get this number is positive. Enter a line of text. Let's put in pager. And we get the 90s called, and they want their technology back. Either that, or you have time traveled. And one other thing I want to point out is with this elif statement that I have here as our final line of code, is that you can see we have multiple lines of code inside of this elif, and they, of course, are both tabbed over. And so that's an important distinction here, is that when you have multiple lines of code beneath one of your conditions, make sure that they are in the same indentation level. Because if this was not in this indentation level, if I took this back out, reran the code here, let's just go ahead and put those same values in, 15 and pager. All right, you notice it will give me the same output, but if I were to change this to, let's say, 15 and computer, I now get this print statement because it's not included as part of that elif that we previously had up here.